Thank you for everybody that's joining us remotely from around the world. And if you're watching it on the YouTube channel, thanks for tuning in there as well. So this is our part 3 of our panel series, virtual panel series, kind of showcasing the authors and contributors to the art and art therapy of papermaking. So in this series, this panel series, we're kind of focusing on contributors for the very last section of the book, where folks kind of talk about their personal experiences with papermaking, how they use papermaking in their life, and how it's had an impact on their communities. So we're super thrilled to have these 3 contributors, and I'm not going to say much more except for that welcome and thank you all for attending, and we're really excited to have you.
Yes, I echo that as well. And you'll notice in the corner of this slide, there's a QR code. And at the end, I'll show that as well. But this QR code is to a folder that's like open access of different papermaking resources, not only from this panel, it will have the slides and the recordings and a reference list from the authors, but it includes folders for all the panels that we've been doing September through December. So you can access the previous panels, recordings, the reference lists, and sort of handouts in there as well. So feel free that. And as Drew mentioned, we're featuring part 3 and 3 of the authors. We had 11 authors that contributed to this part of the book, and we are so excited to have a handful of those authors today. And this panel, the format aims to be more conversational, like a relational dialogue between the panelists, as they reflect on a series of group topics that we have for discussion. Drew and I will serve as moderators, and each sort of discussion will be about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. And we hope to have time at the end of the panel for a Q&A with the audience. So if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat box, or wait until the Q&A to be addressed during this time. So I think we're ready to get started. So, yes. So our first panelist that I am excited to welcome is Jennifer L. Davis. Jenny holds a master's degree in education, and at the time of publication, she was working on her master's degree in marriage and family therapy, which I believe now she's finished with school and like legit, like kind of marriage and family therapist. So congrats sort of on that, and finishing and starting all of that. She provides therapy to individuals, couples, and families. And in addition, she conducts papermaking workshops and other therapeutic art classes for groups and communities. Thank you so much, Jenny, for being here.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
thank you. Cool. And our next presenter today is Annie McFarland, Dr. Annie McFarland. Annie is an art therapist, educator, and artist working as an assistant professor of art therapy at West Virginia University. Her current research focuses include trauma recovery, art therapy for health and wellness, and recycled papermaking. She also has clinical experience in inpatient psychiatric centers, palliative and hospice care, and with military populations. So thank you so much, Annie, for participating.
Absolutely. It's good to be here.
Yes. And our third panelist is Denise R. Wolf, who is an artist and art therapist. She's an associate clinical professor at Drexel University and owner and practitioner therapist of Mangata Services. Hopefully I said that correctly. She believes that a neurological understanding of trauma eliminates judgment and creates opportunities for community action care through therapeutic arts processes. So thank you, Denise. It's a pleasure always to work with you. So thank you for joining us today.
Nice. Cool.
Yes.
Welcome, everybody.
Yes.
Very excited for this.
Yes. So our first discussion is really going to focus around the papermaking process and having a dialogue about that. And I think Drew's going to kick us off with this discussion.
Kind of just have a big open question here. We'd like you all to consider how have you used the papermaking process as personal voice? Oh, isn't that a big, wide open question? And I think we're hoping that Jenny, we kind of kick it off with you and then see where it goes from there.
So most recently, personally, I've been working on an art series, creating pieces that reflect my identity. Learning, there was a time that I felt kind of lost in life and was more reacting to events in my life. And so I'm kind of showcasing that through the work and through the paper and the pieces, the fiber that I've chosen. And then also kind of showing through the pieces, the acceptance and confidence that I'm starting to gain with my own identity. And I think developing that through myself will help me to enable other clients working through papermaking to discover their self-identity and to work through that.
Very cool. Nice.
Thank
and
you.
Jenny most very recently was in Hamburg.
Yeah.
Kind of scaling the walls of the city and making paper. So I hope that has helped contribute to your artistic explorations.
It absolutely has. Yeah. The piece
Cool.
was really inspired by walking around Hamburg and getting a little lost in Hamburg and what that was like, and kind of comparing that to, everything else in my life. Right.
Cool. Very cool. Very interesting.
And last week was the American Art Therapy Association conference, and I actually met an art therapist that worked with you, I think at the VA, perhaps. I think when you did your paper making, recently, you had a paper making workshop, I believe. And so I was like, oh, this is so cool, like that small world. And again, that paper maker and art therapist kind of connection. So that was really awesome. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, that was another great experience, paper making in Columbia at a VA hospital. Yeah, that was great too.
Yeah. Thank
cool.
you.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great. Cool. Yeah. Annie, you want us to take a stab at this question?
Yeah. So I kind of have the other reverse experience. Like for me, the idea of using my own personal voice for paper making has been not as prevalent because as therapists and educators, you're always helping other people find their voice. And one thing I've realized from working with Drew recently and Gretchen as well, and just this whole process of writing is that my philosophy is that everyone has a story, and the papermaking process helps people to tell their story. But I've been so focused on other people helping facilitate their stories that this opportunity I had to use my own meaningful fabric for my chapter in my book was actually from a grant that I got through WVU. But my dad passed away and I had a lot of his clothing. And so I was able to get some really nice supplies and order everything I needed to facilitate this. And so I documented the process of cutting up his t-shirts and his ties, pulping it, making paper, and kind of going through the process myself. We always say as art therapists that you never ask your clients to do something you haven't done yourself. And so I was really interested to see how the experience was using fabric that was really personally connected to me too. And it was a really powerful experience. And I think that the cutting and the selection was like probably the most significant part for me, because you start thinking about relationships and memories and events, and it just helped me realize that the paper making process, whether you're using fabric or different recycled paper elements, I mean, there's so many ways that we connect with our experiences and with people through the paper making process, or through the objects that we use too. So that was kind of what my chapter was focused on too. But since I did a workshop with Drew and Gretchen in Ohio, there was a group of students when we did an activity, and they mentioned, like, I think Gretchen, you posed to them, like, what ways could you use the recycled paper making process with certain populations? And one of the groups mentioned something about working with people who've had like religious related trauma, and like using pages of the Bible to like pulp. And like my brain exploded kind of, because I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much symbolic meaning in that, right? Which for some people is like the worst thing you could ever think of, to destroy that. But I started thinking about like what books in my life have been prevalent. And in the past, before I knew about paper making, I used to be like an obsessive dieter. So I had like all these journals of like diet tracking and like calorie counting. And I took the paper and I tore it up and made a collage and used that as the basis. This was, I mean, probably when I was like a freshman in college, so a long time ago. But I started thinking about like the idea of taking books, maybe going to like the Goodwill, getting used books, like the dieting books and the South Beach diet or the Atkins diet, and like pulping, using pages from those books to pulp paper, and then make artwork about body acceptance and kind of explore that as well too. So yeah, so I'm kind of like in this transition period of shifting from client to self, so hopefully, I don't know if that even answered the question or not.
It does. That's really cool.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Annie also traveled to Hamburg a few years ago, and we did a tour throughout the United Kingdom working with ex-combatants from the IRA and the English Army, and had a real hoot of a time making paper, schlepping the Hollander up and down. So cool. Thank you so much. That's really very, very interesting. And how about you, Denise? Denise kind of works from another angle. Actually, it's similar in some ways.
It sounds like I'm next to visit you in Hamburg, so noted.
Exactly.
So yeah, I'm thinking, in preparation for this, a lot about what papermaking has meant to me over the last, I guess, 2 decades, since I've been an art therapist, and initially started out making paper to make paper, right? My background was in art education, and I started out making paper actually for my first wedding anniversary. The traditional gift was paper. So I'm I'll make a card for my husband out of like some of our leftover invitations, and then brought that process to the clients I was working with, to like this level of depth, now 20 years later, after working with, large, I guess, a pretty wide range of clients. Most recently, I attended a retreat, an artist retreat, which was new for me, in hand paper making, and had a week in the mountains of North Carolina to make paper. And so I brought with me, as we do as paper makers, right? I just sort of like grabbed some things, is what, the story I tell myself, which turned out to be some fabric from the prom dress my daughter had made, and a collection of found papers that I keep, a grocery list, and oh my gosh, sorry, there's a bee. Notes people write themselves, ticket stubs, things I find on the ground, and found that paper, we think about paper holding so much, right? So the paper, I oh my gosh, laid the things into the wet pulp, and the paper created these lovely containers for these objects that otherwise were just sort of amphiria just kind of floating around my house. And so deeply personal objects rather than more, like to Annie's point, invested in the process for my clients and, structuring the process for them, bringing my own experiences and thoughts, and really using paper making as a tool for both containing and reflecting. Which super changes my perspective.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Thank
Nice.
you.
Great.
It's great
Thank
to
you.
hear the varying perspectives, but all sort of grounded sort of in the same like practice, and the many different ways that paper making can be used to tell one story or the narrative in that. So thank you. Our next section is going to be focused on methods and applications. And with this sort of group discussion, thinking about what kind of fibers can be used in paper making to help create personal connection and meaning. And I know Annie touched on this like a little bit with the book, pages from a book, and using that to recycle and reform. Any sort of additional thoughts, sort of, Annie, around the different types of fibers, either that you've used personally or in workshops that you've done or planning sort of to do?
Yeah, I think for me, like I started with military veterans because that was what I was introduced with while working with Drew in my grad program. But the idea of thinking about uniforms in terms of profession and experience, so thinking about veterans, of course, but patients, hospital gowns, the medical staff, first responders, those kinds of things. Any kind of uniform that you wear for a job that you're serving other people too. I mean, that connection to experience, I think, is really important to think about, the symbolic nature of it. One of the more recent projects that I've worked on, when Drew visited a couple weeks ago, or maybe more than that now, I don't know, but I guess I should say before Drew came, our School of Art was in touch with a federal correctional institute here, nearby here, and they really wanted to do some art-based activities with some of the inmates. And so I was able to get some damaged uniforms and the blankets from the penitentiary. And so the paper that we made was from these objects. And so I wanted to originally do the workshop in the prison, but of course, taking a large metal object that's very loud and requires a lot of preparation, not practical for that setting. But so what we did was we made paper, and when Drew came, he helped me to pulp all of these things. And then we had my students make the paper. And so now I have the dried paper that I'm going to take to do a workshop with the female inmates too on self-portraiture and hopefully collage self-portraiture. So they'll all use the paper that we've made from the uniforms and then create something on top of it. So, but I think it doesn't have to be fabric, right? Especially if you don't have access to a Hollander beater. Thinking about what kind of paper that you can recycle, what kind of documents you can use, something that's symbolic, it's meaningful, or can you create a piece on paper, something new that represents something, and destroying or tearing that up. I always hate using the word destroying, but repurposing it, I should say, because you're transforming it into something new too. So I think the symbolic meaning, the significance of the item you're using is really what can be used in this process and make it a very personalized process for people using this process. So I think I said the word process about 20 times.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it would be really interesting to see how the inmates respond to these two different types of material, right? One is the uniforms from the COs, right, the corrections officers,
Mhm.
and the other is the bedding that they slept, that keeps them warm at night and it's in their cell. And I can only imagine that the relationship that they have with these materials is completely different. And so I wonder about when you go forward and to do these creative art making exercises and programs with this material, how they respond to it. So it's very interesting to me. Very interesting.
Yes, with Annie on this, the paper making, it's wonderful and lovely to have a beater that can process cloth and fibers, and also, there are other ways. Gretchen and I are moving forward this idea of radical paper making, right? So blender, food processor, just, your fingers and a lot of pressure and a little cup of water. And really expanding its accessibility, moving really far from like the craft of paper making, but still resonating and overlapping with that. Recently, after this retreat, which was in paper making with natural fibers, suddenly so many more options, became available to me for paper processes. I was at the Southeast Asian market. And the sugarcane drinks are made, right, with this big machine, and then there's this pile of discarded sugarcane. So I asked the folks who were running that, could I have it? Because I was looking at it, I'm like, oh, this looks pulpy. I bet I could make paper out of this, or Drew could tell me. Um, And the folks there were so excited that I wanted their trash, that they got me a bag, and then I came back and there was this like massive pile of, all the sugar cane. And it was so exciting. I've yet to return there with some of the paper that I put aside for them, but I have plans to do a workshop this summer where we travel around the Philadelphia watershed area and collect different natural fibers, including a trip to the market, and then process that. And I think that is a connection in a really different way than the slide here that sort of more traditional, portable Holland beater from this workshop that Piece Paper facilitated in oh my gosh, at Penn State, with survivors of sexual trauma, and that the personal materials that these folks brought were, they were invited to bring articles of clothing that connected them to that experience. And it was it really, wow, was incredibly powerful to bear witness to that, and the items that the participants brought and the things that they expressed about the meaning making in the deconstruction. Annie, I'm a fan of that word when it's, followed with reconstruction. And I think about like what I call Janusian hootenanny, right? Or the Greek god Janus, the two faces, right, of deconstruction and reconstruction, and that you can't have one without the other. So those are a lot of words that I just made there.
Yeah, very interesting. And kind of just chiming in on the note of working with different raw plant fibers from your community in Philadelphia. There's actually a handful of other hand paper makers, members of the North American Hand Papermaking Society, that have kind of like explored using invasive species like Japanese knotweed and things like that. And if you don't have their contact, I'd be more than happy to try to put you in contact with them, because that could work really well. It sounds perfect.
Yes, I would love that. In North Carolina, I can't remember the invasive plant kudzu. Kudzu, that's what it was. So we processed a lot of kudzu. So it's this different way to invite in something that's been, pushed out, which has a lot of rich symbolism. And yes, please, Joy, I'd love that connect.
Cool. I'll give it to you later. Cool. Great. Jenny, do you want to try to respond to that question?
Yeah. So in my practice and internship, one of the things that I got to do a lot of is work with couples. I love the couples work. And I was wondering, how am I going to incorporate paper making in with this? I wanted to do a workshop with some of my clients with the paper making. And so I had to bring in bed sheets. So my couples, they brought in bed sheets, and, right there in session, they deconstructed the bed sheet. And so, just the holding of the fiber, and then ripping it up. I had them rip it. And, being curious about the stories that we tell, between the sheets. What do couples talk about between the sheets? What don't they talk about between the sheets? And looking at intimacy in a different way, and building intimacy and working through some of those more difficult things that they were holding on to or not talking about. And then one thing I noticed is we did the deconstruction, in session, but then when we actually made the paper, the couples often invited their families or children to come along as well. And so then having them reconstruct, right, reauthor, retell these stories in the making of the paper from the bed sheets. Fascinating. We got into some really deep conversations, and I think that, the other two talked about, Annie and Denise, about, the stories that are there and the stories that are evoked. Holding these fibers in your hand, brings up stories, brings up memories. And then having each partner tell, their version of those stories and kind of finding connection there. And so powerful. I'm anxious to do more of it.
Kind of really curious about what you all would recommend to someone who wants to share their story through papermaking. So maybe just some suggestions about where people can begin, or just something maybe that you've learned through your own journey, something that you'd like to share with somebody. And maybe Denise, if you want to kick this off.
Yes, absolutely. Where to begin? I think, oh my gosh, get curious about why you want to make paper. That's a great place to start. And then that could, also then help inform what you want to make paper with. Is it important to you to make paper with a particular, object or objects, right? Sheets or old clothes, or love letters, hate letters, pregnancy tests, things like that. Or are you more process guided or content guided? And I think that's a good question for sort of each time we engage in art, right? Well, like, what are we drawn towards? And then what do you have access to, right? Like there are places here in the Philadelphia area that will process fibers, right? I could drop them and have it pulped for me because I don't have access to a Hollander beater. Or are you more interested in whatever you can run through your food processor? And so, right, the sort of the why and the how and the what, I think, are really important questions to start with. And then once you answer those, the world is your oyster. Paper's really forgiving. And if what you're doing isn't working, you can kiss it off, which is a great kind of pun, right? Or just, return the oh my gosh, the wet sheet back to the pulp.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
Yeah. Jenny, do you have any sort of thoughts around what you'd recommend for someone who's wanting to share their story?
Absolutely. So the fiber, I think, choosing those fibers again is really important. You can choose fibers that are symbolic of an event in your life or time in your life. However, I really do think that, actual fibers like, a work shirt or, something directly connected to the event. I think there's a certain energy in those fibers. And I think handling those fibers, deconstructing and reconstructing those fibers will help kind of elicit more of those stories. And then also mindfulness, maybe doing some additional journaling daily really connects you to your thoughts, and it's more intentional, and recognizing those thoughts and the feelings that come with those thoughts, right? And then putting them down onto paper. that the mindfulness and taking your time, not being in a rush when making the paper, when deconstructing, really, slowing the process down, being very intentional and mindful throughout the process.
Yeah, those are
Yeah,
great.
those are all
Great
like great
suggestions.
elements, I feel like, of paper making, and reminders to ourselves as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah. And Annie, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, kind of echoing what Jenny said too, the symbolic nature of the fibers that you choose. The thing that I was really impressed with too, when the first time I saw the Peace Paper Project working with veterans, was how gentle they were in terms of only cut up what you're comfortable with. If there's an item that you only have one of, it cannot be replaced. If you don't feel like you're ready to cut that up, maybe use a t-shirt that has the Marines logo on it instead of your actual uniform. So substituting things and doing that does not mean that it's any less significant or any less meaningful of an experience, but really being in tune kind of with that intuitive feeling. If you're using this for yourself too, is make sure that you're ready to part with that, because that can be a pretty emotional process. But if not, figure out a way to continue that idea or that symbolic processing of that too. And I like what Jenny was saying too, the idea of journaling. Like, if there's something that you're not ready to part with, maybe try writing about it and then pulp that. Start with something that's a little bit easier, or just try something that you have no emotional attachment to at all, right? And just, if you want more of that process focused, like Denise was saying too, like you want that experience, the sensory based, you want to try it, get more about the craft, right? There's all sorts of ways you can do to work up to that too. So, but I think just being gentle with yourself and allowing yourself flexibility to say, no, I'm not going to do that, and give yourself permission to say yes or no, whatever feels right to you. So.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you
Yes.
very much.
Yeah. I've also used writing with clients that I've done paper making with, whether they're copying from their journal, and pulping things from that, or even using magazine photo collage images that represent things they want to let go of or release. And those can be magazine collage, like words or images. So it still holds that connection or symbolism for them in a visual way, but it's not something that like they've worn or that they're in possession sort of with that. So I think there's so many options that are available for that. Yeah.
Can I add some? I'd like to
Sure.
add something.
Yeah.
Thanks to Jenny. I guess to everybody's point too. There's like, I'm a process gal. So the process in and of itself can be really significant. And if, there aren't personal objects that call to you to be added, the process of paper making itself can be very grounding and slow things down. It's very, sequential and step oriented. And I think simply being in that space and following the process of paper, if you're working with a sheet that you bought from Arnold Grumman or whatever, and put that in your blender, and it has no personal symbolic significance to you, the qualities, sensory qualities of paper making itself are incredibly valuable, and that is as fine of a point of entry as it is using, pulping an object of personal significance.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I would
Thank you
agree.
for
Yeah, I
adding
think so.
that.
And I think so. And I think that I would say, kind of adding to that or whatever, it's just that folks shouldn't be afraid to take risks and try new things, and not be afraid of, like, the idea of like being a high craftsman or a craftsperson, just to kind of like go out and explore and see where it takes you and enjoy the journey, right? The journey is the destination, especially when it comes to paper making. So yeah, just
Yes.
give it a shot and see where it takes you.
Mhm.
And not to be afraid. Like I recently had a brother that passed away as a result of injuries in a fire. And I took material from the fire from the house and his old gauze pads and things from his injury and his old clothing. And I pulped it and made paper and did a whole portfolio of work, kind of reflecting on this part of his journey. And it was super hard. And kind of going back to the idea of not doing something or not asking people to do something that you haven't done before. And it was the first time I had really gone through this process myself, and it was extremely scary. It was terrifying. And there were many moments from the time that I unzipped my suitcase when I got to my studio in Hamburg that I was asking myself, do I really want to do this? Am I prepared to do this? Am I able to do this? And I just kind of put one foot in front of the other and took it step by step. And as you all have talked about, kind of went forward with intention and also a slowness to the process that if you've ever attended a piece of paper project workshop, you know that slow is not what we do. But it kind of I was able to take my time with it. And I guess I would say to not be alarmed if you're afraid, and don't be afraid of being afraid, because the process will guide you.
Yeah. And there's control sort of in that process. You're in control sort of that. If you need to take steps back or steps forward or take a break,
Yeah.
you can go at your own pace.
When you're choosing your fibers, right? Thinking about the meaning behind the fibers and why you're choosing them, being curious about the stories that they tell and the thoughts that come up. And I think slowing down helps with that intention, keeping in mind, your ultimate goal. Are you wanting to process through feelings and emotions about a particular, maybe it's grief, maybe you're working through grief. And so as you are doing the steps in the paper making, to really be focused on what you're doing, and to be, if it's of a certain person, to try to stay focused on that person and the thoughts that come up with that, what they meant to you, and what losing them looks like as well. Being mindful of what you're experiencing emotionally as you're going through this as well.
Yeah.
Does that kind of answer the question a little bit?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think so, for sure. One of the things that we do a lot with the veterans at the VA, and maybe Jenny, you did this when you were in Colombia, is we ask the folks to pull a sheet of paper. At first, they pull a sheet of paper for themselves from their branch of service, right? And then maybe they print an image or something on there. But then we ask them to pull a sheet of paper from a branch of service for a friend or a buddy or somebody they served with or a neighbor. And it's really interesting to watch how when they go from pulling a sheet of paper for themselves, they're kind of like, okay, I'm going to do this. And then when it's kind of they're focusing on making a sheet of paper for somebody else, they get super focused, the energy changes, and they're much more intentional about what they're creating. And it's really amazing to watch how the energy shifts. And it really is somewhat telling about how folks will kind of, when it comes to taking care of yourself, we might be a little bit more sloppy, but when we're kind of taking care of others, we're much more focused on, okay, and so I think that that's part of like what it means to be intentional, just in that small window of an example. How about you, Denise? Anything to add? I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Drew. It's a messy, oh my gosh, juicy endeavor. Right, you might want to wear rain boots and an apron, right. And so like I say all that to create the space and time in your life to explore paper making. This is really different than sitting down with watercolor color pencils. Right, this is media and sensory rich, and it is a process. And it is not fast, even for piece paper. It's still not. And so to be intentional and bring your whole self and create that time for yourself to engage in this process can be really valuable and meaningful. Again, process gal, moving through that and honoring your own time and creativity is valuable and important. And so, yeah, process and product.
Yes, and while you are speaking, Denise, I think about your reflection in the book is about when process mirrors content, right? Or yeah, with that, and your own experience with doing paper making with a group of adolescents, and that experience and what like lessons learned from that, and I think it's a really great example of intentional kind of paper, not just the actual part, like the pooling and the pulping and the pressing, but also like the preparation, and setting things up and the structuring of that. You did a wonderful job of really describing how that's really valuable too, when you're introducing paper making to a group of others, and the fluidness of that can be very regressive sometimes. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yes, it's and if you haven't read the book yet, go out and get it right now.
Go out and get it.
Thank you, Denise. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Annie, anything you want to chime in on?
Yeah, I think Denise kind of summarized it really well. But this idea, like in art therapy, we're always talking about process and product, and it's not one or the other. It can be both, but I think of it more of like a pie chart, right? The percentages, like, do you want this experience? Are you intentional about being the sensory based, the mindfulness components, the process itself, or the content and the product, right? And so it can be both, but sometimes I think it's better to get away from the content, like Denise was saying, just to be present and to be experiencing that process, that sensory based product.
Was, do you ever get so into the process that you make so much paper that you don't know what to do with it? And if so, what do you do with all of the extra paper?
Oh, very good question.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Well, I know Annie can speak to this a little bit.
My personal experience was I have all this paper that's of my dad's stuff, and it's like it's become such like a precious thing that I'm afraid to even put anything on it. Like if I mess it up, it's ruined, even though in my mind I know I could just tear it up and repulp it and make it again, but there is kind of like this sense of like it's a permanent thing and you can't ever get it back. It's like this connection, I think, to the fabric and maybe reflective of that process of cutting it up. So I have probably about 50 sheets of paper that are all blank, that made out of my dad's stuff, that I still am like, I don't even know what to do with these, So that, yeah, I think that kind of, if you have that emotional connection, there's a chance that you can kind of get paralyzed by that kind of decision of what to do with it. I mean, that was my experience too, but I know a lot of other people say like, you have plenty of paper, just make something, like just jump into it too. So I think it's a kind of an individual experience, and also too, how much paper do you have? Like if you only have 1 or 2 sheets, then that's going to change, like if I mess this up, versus like, although in my case, maybe I'm just so neurotic that I have to have all blank sheets, all 60. I don't know. So, but that is, it's a hard decision to make. Like, what am I going to do? As Drew says, activate the paper. You don't want to just make it and then put it in a box and put it on your shelf. You want to do something to continue that transformative process too.
Yeah. But you could also go at your own pace related to that too, and slow things down, or, take time to reflect, there's no timetable with that also. So
is there a difference from your experience between a symbolic paper or a piece of cloth cloth concerning the emotions coming up. So is there a difference from your experience between a symbolic paper? So like a letter would be an example, I think is what she's referring to, like as a symbolic paper, or maybe it's a newspaper of the assassination of John F. Kennedy or something like that, right? Or versus a piece of cloth. Do you guys want to talk about that at all? Like, we kind of already have explored it a little bit.
I'll take a
Denise?
stab. Yeah, I'll jump in on that. One difference would be how the paper is made. If you're making paper from paper recycling or repurposing, that's, could be done in a without a Hollander beater. So, and then using cloth, it's a longer process. It's and it's loud and it feels different. There's a whole different sensory experience of being around a Hollander beater while it's grinding down the fibers of the cloth. So that would be one difference. And then in terms of like your own personal connection to the cloth or the symbolic paper, the answer to that is like the answer to most things, which is it depends. I like to
Exactly, right?
what the meaning, what does it mean to the person who's making the paper?
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to, I think with Olivia's kind of exploring is this idea of like maybe something that's symbolic to the, like letters. Maybe they're letters that somebody wrote home while they were deployed in the service. And then this person's like, hey, I no longer want to carry this weight around. And I'd like to tear these letters up and then pulp them. And there's emotional meaning and there's intention in that process. But are these letters, maybe if they're from World War II or something, is that like historical record that you're destroying? And versus maybe the military uniform that maybe somebody wore in World War II is an article of clothing that somebody wore, and not so much like I don't know, historical document. Am I kind of getting close? I think so. I think that maybe there is a little bit of difference in some of the relationship that we have with these kinds of materials, and then of course the process, tearing something up and throwing in a blender is definitely different than cutting up rag and putting it in a Hollander, just because it's obviously a different technique. And so, but both I think require this idea of intention and having some sort of relationship with the material, right?
Yeah.
Kind of,
Yeah.
kind of.
And I think it also speaks to the importance too of the process, and that process versus product that we've been talking about. Even if the actual pulping material isn't significant in some way to the individual, I'm just thinking of students, that we've had in workshops, teaching them about, paper making and the process and how it can be used therapeutically in different ways. They might not have a connection at all to the actual pulp and what it's made out of, but just the process of the steps and the mindfulness and just learning and the structure of that. Or I think about Denise's experience with the adolescents. That wasn't, unless I'm thinking differently, I don't think that was like connected in any way to them, but they were just learning how to do like paper making, and how just that just those steps can be so valuable and meaningful and symbolic in so many different ways around like containment and working together and collaboration and mastering like a new skill, or like your sense of self and confidence, and that really being like a symbolic way, like a different kind of connection symbolically. You want to continue the discussion. There is a discussion forum that we have on Facebook that's connected to our book page as well. And actually this QR code, hopefully my camera is not blocking that, but this QR code like goes directly to the forum if you're not already a part of that. It's a private forum. A lot of the authors are also included there, and so you can ask questions or share resources in that sort of space. And let's see, let me forward this. This again is the QR code for the papermaking resources and all the panels. So this is also something you can scan and is available. It's open access to use, and this will be included on the slide presentation as well. And then just a thank you to Jenny and Annie and Denise. And this is contact information if you'd like to reach out to them or have any questions or learn more from them. That is where you can connect with them with that.
Yeah, cool. Thank you all. Thanks
Yes,
everybody for
yeah.
attending. Oh, look at this
Yes.
bibliography.
Yes, this is just some selected references from their collective chapters there as well. And I think that is about it with that. And this is our very last panel in December that we're having that's focusing on paper making in different settings. And it'll feature Raul Deal, who spoke at the beginning of this series with different settings that he's engaged paper making with students. And then Amy Ricard as well and her work. So yeah, we're looking forward to that in about a month or so. So
In about
yeah.
a month. Great.
Yeah.
Cool.
That is it.
Well, thank you all so much. Thanks everybody for participating and everybody who kind of attended. I really appreciate the attention, and we hope that we can inspire a new generation of art therapy and paper makers together, and also continue with the work that so many have done before, using paper making as a form of socially engaged art practice, including John Rousseau, who I saw was attending this workshop, and he's really I would say the grandfather of all of this.
Yes.
So thank you so much, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.